We continue now at the top of Daf Yomi Gemara Amud Aleph and Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 13a. On the previous summit, Ben Azai said that carbon ola, just like carbon chatas and carbon pesach, is completely disqualified if it's shalol lishma. And the Gemara in the previous summit suggested that Ben Azai learns that from a tzad hashava, from the combination of carbon pesach and carbon chatas. Just like carbon pesach and carbon chatas are pasul, they're completely disqualified if they're shalol lishma. So too, Ben Azai says that the carbon ola is completely disqualified if it's shalol lishma. And the Gemara asked on the previous summit that the tzad hashava doesn't work because both carbon pesach and carbon chatas, they have a tzad hashava that the carbon ola does not have. They have a tzad kares, they have an element of kares. And the Gemara says to that according to Ben Azai, tzad kares lo parach, he doesn't ask questions from tzad kares. The fact that they have an element of kares is not enough to refute the tzad hashava. And Rashi explains that tzad kares lo parach, he doesn't ask from tzad kares, lefi she'eno shava b'shneim, because the kares by chatas and pesach are not really equivalent. The chatas eno onish kares al havaso. When it comes to a carbon chatas, you're not getting kares with regards to bringing the chatas. Ela she'al shigagas kares hu ba. It's just that if you do an aveira which b'mezid would be kares if you do that b'shogeg, so then you bring a chatas. That's what it means that there's a tzad kares by chatas. Pesach, whereas when it comes to the carbon pesach, onish kares al havaso, a person can be punished kares if the person does not bring the carbon pesach, and so therefore, again, the tzad kares is not exactly the same, so you can't refute the tzad hashava from the tzad kares. But the Gemara continues and asks, Asham nami laisi, but Asham also, Ben Azai should be able to use the tzad hashava to say that Asham also is totally disqualified if it's shalol lishma. And the Gemara says to that, Asham parich, by the carbon Asham, we can ask as follows. Mal hatzad hashava shebehen, what is the common denominator of carbon chatos, carbon pesach, carbon ola as well? Sheken yeshnan betzibur keviyachid, because they exist as carbon sibor, they exist as public carbonos, just like they are private carbonos. That is not true when it comes to carbon Asham. And Rashi explains, Asham nami laisi, Asham also, we should say, lifsol b'shalol lishmo, we should use the tzad hashava to say that it's totally disqualified if it's shalol lishmo. Mi binyan avin, we should make it from the same tzad hashava. Kido amar Rabbi Eliezer la'el, now this was actually suggested earlier by Rabbi Eliezer, to kamar le Rabbi Yoshua chozarni chalila, Rabbi Yoshua said, you can go back and forth, and again the Gemara said, uparchina, the Gemara there asked, v'lahader dina, so go back and forth, and let's make a tzad hashava, v'laisi b'mahatzad, and use a mahatzad, use a tzad hashava to include Asham as well. V'salikno lahachas skafta, and the Gemara over there concluded on that question, mishum deikol mifrach, that the reason why you're not able to bring Asham from a tzad hashava is because you can refute it with the exact same refutation we just said above, ma'ala tzad hashava shebehen shekein yesh behen tzad kares, that the tzad hashava, the common denominator is they have a tzad kares, and therefore we can't bring Asham. But again, if we're now saying that according to Ben Azai we don't ask from tzad kares, because Ben Azai doesn't say that that's a real refutation, so now we're back to the question, Asham also can be brought with this tzad hashava. Umeshani leBen Azai Asham mipircha acharisa mesalik le, and we answer for Ben Azai that there's another refutation Ben Azai will use in terms of why we cannot derive Asham, the lo laisi b'ben yanav, that we can't learn it from a tzad hashava, the parich mala tzad hashava shebehen sheyesh no betzibur, because the tzad hashava of both carbon pesach and carbon chatas is they exist as carbonos sibor. And Rashi notes, Pesach karile carbon sibor, Pesach is referred to as a carbon sibor, even though each individual group brings their own carbon pesach, but that's called a carbon sibor. Kedamram b'seder Yuma, like we say in Yuma b'perakot ziulo mishum da'asi b'chenufya. Again, it's brought by the congregation, it's brought by a large multitude of people, and therefore, again, the carbon pesach is considered to be a carbon sibor, and so therefore you cannot learn out Asham, because again, the common denominator is Yeshnan B'tzibur K'viyachid, which is not true by an Asham. And the Gemara continues, V'iba Yisem, if you want, I could say, that Tzad Kares Nami Parach, that actually Ben Azai does refute a Tzad Hashava from Tzad Kares, and so then we're back to our question, where does he learn out carbon ola? Uven Azai Gemara Gomer Lan, Ben Azai really, he just had a tradition with regards to the carbon ola that it's also disqualified if it's Shalol Lishma. V'had Kamer Rav Huna Kal V'chomer, and that which Rav Huna brought a Kal V'chomer, not a tradition, Lo Amra Ela L'chadid Bo Talmidav, he just said that to sharpen the minds of his students. And Rashi explains, Gemara Gomer Lami Pi Ayin Beis Zekanim. He had a tradition from the 72 elders, Kedetanan, as we learned in the Mishnah earlier. L'chadei Talmidav, that was just to sharpen his students. Sheyikshu lo teshuv olav. This way they could ask questions on it. Their minds would be sharper. Inami, or it means to say Sheyitnu libam lios charifin, that they're going to pay attention to be sharp. Lidrosh kalim v'chamurim, in order to darshan their own kal v'chomers me'aleim on their own. Ke Ben Azai, just like Ben Azai. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, HaPesach v'hachatos sheshechotan shelo lishmon. If a person slaughters a Karban Pesach or Karban Chatas shelo lishmon, and kibel v'holach v'zarek shelo lishmon, or let's say he receives the blood, he walks the blood over, he throws the blood shelo lishmon, o lishmon v'shelo lishmon, or let's say he starts the process lishmo, but then ends it shelo lishmo, o shelo lishmon v'lishmon, or the other way around, he starts it out shelo lishmon, then he ends up lishma. In all of these cases, psulim, in all of these cases, they are disqualified. Ketzad lishmon v'shelo lishmon. What does it mean that he does it at first lishma and then not lishma? It means l'shem Pesach. He starts out, he has in mind the Karban Pesach, which is the carbon that he's bringing. L'shem shlamim, but then he ends up having in mind the Karban shlamim. That's shelo lishma. Shelo lishmon v'lishmon. What does it mean that he starts out shelo lishma then lishma? That would be the reverse. L'shem shlamim. He starts out that it's a shlamim, even though really it's a Karban Pesach. L'shem Pesach, but then he ends up lishma. He ends up that it's Karban Pesach. Shazevach nifsal bi'arba devarim, because the carbon is disqualified at 4 different stages: b'shchita, uvekibul, uvehilach, uvezrika, by the slaughtering, by the receiving of the blood, by the walking over of the blood to the mizbeach, and by the zrika, the throwing of the blood to the mizbeach. And the Mishnah continues, Rabbi Shimon machshir behilach. Rabbi Shimon says it's kosher even if the hilach, the walking over of the blood, is done shelo lishma. Shahayomer, because he says Iyavshar shelo b'shchita v'shelo b'kabol. It's impossible to bring a carbon without slaughtering it, without receiving the blood, v'shelo b'zrikan, without throwing the blood. Aval efshar below hilach, but it's possible to have a carbon without hilach, without walking over the blood to the mizbeach, because shochid b'tzad ha-mizbeach v'zorek, because you could really slaughter right next to the mizbeach and then throw the blood immediately, and therefore, since it's not a critical avoda, therefore it does not disqualify the carbon. And the Mishnah continues, Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says, Hamahalech b'makom shu tzarich lahalech. If he's walking in an area where he needs to walk, then machshava poselas. Then if he has an intention that can disqualify, it disqualifies. But b'makom she'eno tzarich lahalech. But if he's walking in a place where walking is not necessary, so then ein machshava poselas. Then his intention does not cause a disqualification. And Rashi explains, V'kibel v'holach v'zarak, he receives the blood and he walks the blood over and he throws the blood, o katani, this is either or, meaning kibel, he receives it, o halach, or he walks it over, o zarak, or he throws it again, shalo lishmo. And then the Mishnah said, o lishmo v'shalo lishmo, or he does it lishmo and shalo lishmo. And Rashi explains, shachisha ba'avoda achas, that he thinks within one avoda, he thinks lishmo v'shalo lishmo. He thinks it's lishmo, and then he thinks it's shalo lishmo. And then the Mishnah said, aval efshar below hilach, but it's possible it's possible to bring the carbon without walking over the blood. Hilkach lo chashiva lemifsal. Therefore, it's not important enough to create a disqualification. And then the Mishnah said, "Hamahalech b'makom shu tzarich loholech." If he's walking in a place where he needs to walk, holacha zu machshava poselas. But that kind of walking, so an intention is able to disqualify the carbon. Im chisha ba shelo lishma. If he thinks during that time shelo lishma. Uv Gemara mefarish lemil say ma'it tzarich u'mayin tzarich. The Gemara will explain what it means: a place where he needs to walk and a place where he does not need to walk. And the Gemara says, "V'kabola mi pasla." Does the receiving of the blood with the wrong intent, does that really disqualify a carbon? V'atanya, but we learned in a brayso v'hikrivu, it says that they're going to bring it close. Zu kabolas hadam, that refers to the receiving of the blood. Ata omer kabolas hadam, you say that refers to the receiving of the blood. Oeno elazrika, maybe that refers to the throwing of the blood. Kishu omer v'zarku, when the pasuk says v'zarku, that they throw it. Harei zrika omer, so throwing is mentioned. Hamani mekayim v'hikrivu, so what does it mean v'hikrivu? Zu kabolas hadam, that refers to the receiving of the blood. And then the pasuk says b'nei Aaron haKohanim. It says v'hikrivu b'nei Aaron haKohanim, that the sons of Aaron, the Kohanim, will bring it. Shetei b'kohen kosher v'kli shares. That teaches us that it has to be with a kohen that's kosher and with a kli shares, with one of the vessels that's used to serve in the Beis Hamikdash. Amar Rabbi Akiva says, Minayin l'kabola shalotei ela b'kohen kosher v'kli shares. From where do we know that the receiving of the blood has to be with a kosher kohen and with a kli shares? Nemar kan b'nei Aaron. It says over here b'nei Aaron, like we just said. V'nemar lahalan, and it says further on, Eila shmos b'nei Aaron haKohanim hameshuchim. These are the names of the sons of Aaron, the Kohanim, who were anointed. Malahalan b'kohen kosher v'kli shares. Just like over there, we were talking about a kosher kohen and kli shares, afkan b'kohen kosher v'kli shares. So it's over here, we're talking about a kohen kosher and a kli shares. Amar Rabbi Tarfon said, Akapeach esbonai, I'll bury my sons, im lo shamati lahavchin hefresh bein kabola zrika. If I didn't hear that there is a distinction between the receiving of the blood and the throwing of the blood, vainly the farish, but I don't know how to explain the distinction. Rabbi Akiva says, Ani afarish, I can explain it. Kabbalah, when it comes to the receiving of the blood, lo asaba machshava kemaisa, the intention is not considered like the action, meaning to say, if a person has the wrong intention, it's not going to disqualify the carbon. But zrika, but when it comes to the throwing of the blood, asaba machshava kemaisa, we say that the intention is like an action, and therefore you have the wrong intention, it can disqualify the carbon. And furthermore, kiblo bachutz, let's say you receive the blood outside of the Beis HaMikdash, eino chayiv kares, the person is not liable to the punishment of kares. And that's different than zrika, zarko bachutz, if you throw it outside of the Beis HaMikdash, onish kares, there's a punishment of kares. And furthermore, kiblu psulin, let's say it's received by people who are disqualified, ein chayavin olav, they're not going to be liable for that. And that's different than zrika, zarku psulin, if people that are disqualified, if they throw the blood, chayavin olav, they will be liable with regards to that. Amar lo Rabbi Tarfon said to him, Ho'avoda, I take an oath by the service in the Beis HaMikdash, atitisi yominu small, if you've strayed right or left, meaning to say, this is exactly, ani shamati, I heard this way, ve'enli lafarish, but I couldn't explain it, ata dorish, now you're darshaning it, umaskim l'shmu, and it's agreeing exactly with what I heard, you're saying exactly correctly what I heard. B'loshen hazeh amar lo, and then Rabbi Tarfon said to him the following language, Akiva, he said to him, Rabbi Akiva, kol ha'poresh mimcha, anybody that separates from you, kiporesh mechayiv, it's like separating from life. And the Gemara continues and answers, Amar Rava says, Lokash, it's not difficult, kan b'machsheves pigul, kan b'machsheves shelo lishma. In one case, we're talking about an intention of pigul, which is when the person intends to consume the carbon after the allotted time. In that situation, that kind of machshava by Kabbalah will not disqualify the carbon. But our Mishnah is talking about a machshava, it's talking about an intention shelo lishma, and that will disqualify the carbon if it happens during the Kabbalah, during the receiving of the blood. And the Gemara says, Dekonami, we can infer this as well from the language of the Mishnah, Dekatani, because it says in the Mishnah, Shazevach nifsal, it says that the carbon is disqualified, Velo katani mispagil, it doesn't use the word mispagil, which would indicate pigul, and Shema Mina, the Gemara says, indeed, we see that from the language of the Mishnah. And Rashi explains, B'kohen kosher, it has to be with a kosher kohen, la'fuke chalolim uvale mumin, that comes to exclude someone who's a chalal, that's a kohen, who's not considered to have the kedusha of the kuna, and bale mumin, those kohanim that have blemishes, those would be not kosher kohanim, uvechlishares, and then the Brisa said with klishares, which are vessels that serve in the mikdash, and Rashi says that means over here, shiyu meluboshim bigdei kahuna, it means that the kohanim have to be wearing the bigdei kahuna. It's not a reference necessarily to the actual vessels, the kalim, in the Beis HaMikdash, it's a reference to the begodim, the garments that the Kohanim wear. The Kohanim mashma bikihunam, because when it says Kohanim, it implies it's understood bikihunam when they're wearing those garments. V'hainu bigdei kahuna. That refers to bigdei kahuna. And Rashi notes v'chalecha de katani nami bekohen kosher v'chlishares. Anytime you have the phrase kohen kosher and klishares bevigdei kahuna kamer, that's referring to the garments of the kahuna. And the Gemara continues with the two dots. Umachsheves pigol lo pasla b'kabbalah. Is it really true that an intention of pigol would not disqualify a carbon by the Kabbalah during the receiving of the blood? But we learned in a brayso, so yachol lote machshava moelas ela bezrika bilvad. One might think that the intention is only effective during the zrika, during the throwing of the blood. Minayin l'rabos shchita v'kabbalah. From where do we know to include the slaughtering and the receiving of the blood? You see clearly in this brayso we're talking about the receiving of the blood. Talmud Lomer, the pasuk says, V'im he'achol yachel mipsar zevach shlomav lo yeirotza. The context of this pasuk is pigul. The full pasuk will take a look at Vim he'achol yachel mipsar zevach shlomav bayom hashlishi lo yeirotza hamakrev oso lo yechoshev lo pigul yia. So you see the pasuk is talking about pigul, and we darsh in the pasuk that the pasuk means bidvorim hamevian lidei achila, all of the parts of the process that bring one to the consumption of the carbon hakasa medaber. That's what the pasuk is talking about, and so therefore it's not only at the zrika but at these other stages as well, shchita and kabbalah, that you can have machsheves pigul. Now yochel shanimar ba'af shvichas shirayim v'aktara say more, and one might think I can include that machsheves pigul can disqualify during the pouring out of the remainder of the blood, of the leftover blood, or during the burning of the emur in the sacrificial portions. Talmud Lomer, the pasuk says, "Bayom hashlishi lo yeratza hamakriv oso lo yechoshev," and the Gemara understands this pasuk as follows: Zrika bechlal haisa. Zrika really is included in the generalization. V'lama yatzasa. Now, why is it being specified over here? Lahakasheletz, to make a comparison. Lomar lach, to say to you, ma zrika miyuchedes shi avoda. Just like zrika is unique, that it's an avoda, u'ma'akeves kapara, and it holds back. It's something that is required for the kapara, for the atonement. Afkol avoda u'ma'akeves kapara. So too, we're talking about any kind of avoda that can hold back the atonement, that's critical for the atonement. Yatzu shvicha shirayim v'aktaras emurin. That excludes the pouring out of the remainder of the blood and the burning of the sacrificial portions. She'ein ma'akven es hakapara. Those are not required for the kapara. That's what we learn from that pasuk. And Rashi explains, Af shvichas shirayim, one might have thought that also the pouring out of the remainder of the blood is included in machsheves pigul, meaning to say, Im shafach shirei hadam liyasod. If a person pours out the leftover blood to the yasod of the mizbeach, al manas lechol basar chutz lizmana, with the intention of eating the meat outside of the proper time. O im hikter emurin b'machshavazur. Let's say again he had the same intention when burning the emurin. So we say no. We learn from the pasuk lo yerotza. The pasuk says lo yerotza. It's not accepted. Hainu zrika. That refers to zrika shehi meratza, because that's the part that makes it accepted. And bechlal haisa, zrika was really already included in the generalization. Bechlal hadvarim hamavin li'de'achila, because that's one of the things that bring the carbon, that the carbon is going to be consumed. That's one of the steps in the process. And so therefore, why is zrika singled out? Again, it's to say that it has to be a part of the process that is ma'akev. And she'ein ma'akvin, however, when it comes to shirayim and when it comes to haktaras emurin, they are not ma'akev. Shirayim ein ma'akvin kedatanya be'ezeh makoman. Shirayim is not ma'akev. That's a brisa in Ezeh makoman later on. And also haktaras emurin lo ma'akvin. Haktaras emurin is also not ma'akev kapara. It's also not ma'akev the atonement. T'chsiv hadam hu b'nefesh yechaper, as it says in the pasuk. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Yud Gimel Amid Beis.